A secret caller told me that my wife was with her lover at a romantic dinner. In less than 20 minutes, I was in the car, with my fingers shaking on the steering wheel and my heart so tight that for a moment I thought I might pass out. The name of the restaurant sounded familiar to me, one of those places where we celebrate what matters, where we toast the most intimate moments of our lives together. A place where, not long ago, I had declared my love for her in front of everyone. She looked at me with shining eyes that night and said, in a soft voice, that being with me was her greatest luck. And now, here she was again, in the same place, only with someone else. The parking lot was full, and for a moment I hesitated. My face burned. His throat felt inflamed from holding back the scream that was forming. I entered the restaurant like a stranger in my own story, my eyes scanning each table like a detective who doesn't want to find what he's looking for. But there they were. Her hair done in a way that I myself praised the other day, the dress that I bought for our last anniversary, the earrings that she said she would only wear on special occasions. They were side by side, her hands on the table, her eyes fixed on his, and between smiles and toasts, she leaned closer, as she did with me on our best days. The world seemed to slip away from me when she laughed in that way that was only mine before. They saw me, and despair took over them both as if they had just seen a ghost. She turned white, completely pale, and he froze with the wine glass in the air. I walked to the table in silence, my every step echoing in my own ears as if I were walking through a courtroom. I sat down, calmly pulling out the chair, looking at the two of them with the serenity of someone who spent entire nights finding the courage to accept a truth that, deep down, I always knew existed. And so, I made an announcement. An announcement that made their skin pale even more, an announcement that took the air out of the room and turned smiles into muffled screams. She tried to speak, her hands shaking, but her voice was weak. He stood up abruptly, looked around as if looking for an exit that didn't exist. There was no escape. All eyes were on us. I smiled, pain hidden in my clenched teeth, and handed her an envelope. Inside, everything she had already lost without realizing it, control of our finances, credit card access, house documents, all the contracts we once signed together. She handed them to me confidently, and I used them coolly. She remained silent, as if she knew this was just the beginning. That night, I returned home with a strange sense of relief. Not because I discovered the betrayal, that was eating me up inside, but because I stopped being the man who believed everything was fine. I started to see our history with clear eyes. Her every absence now made sense. Every excuse, every night of headache, every forced smile. I remembered a time when I surprised her with flowers one late afternoon and she said, without looking up from her cell phone, that she was busy. It was him. It was always him. And I, a puppet hanging by the strings of my own loyalty. The cell phone messages started arriving the next day. She cried during the recordings, saying she didn't want to lose me, that it was a mistake, that it was just once, that dinner was unimportant. But there was something in her eyes that night at the restaurant, something that told me it wasn't the first time. I had seen that glow before, but it wasn't for me. The strangest thing was realizing that, even though I was torn apart, I didn't want to destroy her. I wanted her to feel what I felt. I wanted her to wake up on a Sunday morning feeling like the world was out of place. That she looked to the side and there was no one. That he opened the door to his house and felt the emptiness filling every corner. The days that followed were torture. The bed felt cold even under thick blankets. Her scent was still on the pillow. The memory of his touch on my back was an invisible slap that repeated itself every dawn. I tried to drown myself in work, but everything brought me back. The alarm on my cell phone at 6 p.m., the time we used to have dinner together. The television series that we left half finished. I learned the recipe just because it was her favorite dish. I had been fooled into silence, while I was making plans for an old age with someone who had not been with me for a long time. The body was there, but her soul was already sleeping in another bed. She tried to find me. He sent letters. He made unexpected visits to the office. Once, she showed up in front of my house wearing the dress she wore to our wedding, completely desperate. I cried as if I were the victim in the story, and that infuriated me. Because she didn't understand. It wasn't about the sex. It wasn't about dinner. It was about breaking. About the betrayal of the look, of trust, of the silent promise you make when you truly love someone. I didn't just lose a wife that night. I lost the ground. I lost the image I had of myself, of the two of us, of everything we had built with so much effort. The lover also tried to justify himself. He came to me as if there was dignity in his words. He said he didn't know she was married, that he was deceived. Lies poorly formulated by a man who knew very well what he was doing. I looked him in the eyes and said just one thing: you thought you could take my most precious thing. Now he's going to watch everything fall apart from his cabin. And he understood. Because what I did next was beyond what was expected. I didn't scream, I didn't start attacking. I used something more powerful: silence and strategy. Without them knowing, everything was already being prepared. And when she least expected it, she received the official warning: she would no longer have access to anything. And more than that, everything he once thought he owned was being transferred. Not for me. But for something bigger. Something that would turn his betrayal into an ironic legacy. The house where we loved each other would now be a shelter for betrayed women. The company she helped run out of convenience but never out of love was donated to a family support foundation. I didn't want a rematch. I wanted justice. I wanted her to look at everything she lost and realize that, at that dinner, the main course was her own life being served on a platter to those who didn't know how to take care of it. It wasn't quick, nor easy. I had nights when I thought about retreating. I had relapses, moments when I almost answered your calls, when I almost answered your messages with longing. But something inside me said I needed to go all the way. I needed to rise again, not as a vengeful man, but as someone who learned that self-love should be greater than any other promise. What happened to her afterwards, that part is the most surprising. Because, like all good betrayal stories, the end is never what you expect. There is a moment, specific and unexpected, that redefines everything. One last ace up her sleeve, a revelation that neither she, nor her lover, nor anyone else imagined. Something that completely changes the course of everything, and that only happened because, that night, when I entered the restaurant with eyes full of pain, I was also carrying a secret. A secret that would make my announcement at that table not only shocking, but irreversible. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support any type of betrayal, on the contrary, we show how it destroys lives, families and hearts. All stories told are fictitious, created to reveal the deep scars left by wrong choices. Get ready, because what you're going to hear now is shocking, realistic, and it will mess with your emotions. Settle in, the story is about to begin. When Oliver met Emily, everything about her seemed like an invitation to the future. There was something about the way she walked, firm but delicate, that made each step feel like a decision, a choice. She wore her hair loose on her shoulders and had that look of someone who knew exactly what she wanted in life, although she had an almost childish lightness in her gestures. He, on the other hand, was a methodical man, silent in his opinions but deep in his feelings. He worked as the financial director of a hotel chain, and liked to say that his routine was his way of protecting those he loved. When they met for the first time, at a business conference in Lisbon, the conversation was natural, as if they had already known each other from other lives. It was at that moment, in that improvised cafe in the lobby of an old hotel, that destiny began to draw itself with lines that seemed clear, but that, deep down, hid invisible curves. The relationship grew quickly, but without rushing. He was coming from a painful breakup, and she was coming from a phase of rediscovery. Emily had a degree in interior design and had recently left a society that had drained her emotionally. She had traded everything for peace, and in Oliver she found refuge. Over time, the two created a routine that felt perfect. They traveled whenever they could, frequented the same restaurants and loved long Sunday walks. Little by little, Sundays became sacred, almost a ritual, long breakfasts, aimless walks, holding hands along flower-filled sidewalks. Oliver felt complete in these moments, as if every moment with her validated his entire story up until that point. Emily also seemed happy, although she had a particular way of keeping her inner turmoil to herself. She was a woman of intense sensations, but who rarely let on what was hurting her. He preferred to smile rather than ask for help, and he covered his absences with long hugs and lingering kisses. They married 2 years later, in an intimate ceremony by the sea, surrounded only by family and a few friends. Emily wore a simple but elegant dress, with discreet lace on her shoulders, while Oliver, nervous as never before, sweated on his hands but smiled with his eyes. Their honeymoon was in Capri, and the two looked more in love than ever. He prepared surprises almost every night, dinners with a view of the sunset, improvised serenades on the guitar he had hidden in his suitcase. She, in turn, reciprocated with passionate looks and gestures of affection that seemed small, but to him were everything. Back to their routine, they bought a house in a quiet and peaceful neighborhood, a house with large windows, a wooden porch and a vegetable garden that he cultivated on the weekends. Emily, who worked independently on decoration projects, set up a small studio in the back of the backyard, a space of her own, full of plants, colorful fabrics and pendant lamps. In everyone's eyes, they formed an enviable couple. They had stability, affection, mutual respect and an active social life. They attended dinners, company events, and made frequent trips to visit friends in other cities. But most importantly, they always went home hand in hand. Oliver was detail-oriented, the type who remembered dates, who left notes in drawers, who prepared the coffee the way she liked it. Emily smiled at these demonstrations, even when she was absorbed in her creations or in distant thoughts. Sometimes, she would get lost for hours in her studio, among paints, sketches and canvases of inspiration. He respected that space. Never questioned. For him, Emily's freedom was an extension of their love. She had always said that she couldn't bear a love that trapped, that suffocated, and he made that his mission, to love her without barriers. However, like any routine that solidifies over time, small silences began to settle between them. Nothing blatant. Nothing that seemed like a threat. Just silences. Those late-night conversations on the couch became less and less, replaced by episodes of unfinished series. Dinners became more practical and less full of intention. The constant tapping gave way to spaced tapping. Emily said she was tired, overwhelmed with projects. Oliver believed it, although he felt something different in the air. He was never one to invade. I preferred to wait until she wanted to share. When asked by friends about the subtle distancing, he said it was a phase, that every couple went through it. And it was true, at least in part. The problem was that, in that house where the two once shared all the details, there were now doors that no longer opened easily. The days continued to repeat themselves with a certain balance, until she started going out more. She said she needed to find inspiration outside of her home, visiting exhibitions, new cafes, other environments that helped her think. Oliver understood. He always encouraged your work, your creative freedom. Sometimes, when she was getting ready to go out, he would watch her from the bedroom door, with a mixture of admiration and melancholy. Emily had always been beautiful, but there was something different about the way she looked in the mirror lately. It wasn't vanity, it was something deeper, perhaps a search, perhaps an emptiness. He was trying not to think too much. He made a point of telling her he loved her before leaving for work. She responded with a quick kiss, a brief smile and lost herself in her own steps again. They still traveled together, even if less frequently. On their last vacation, they went to the mountains, spent a week in a charming inn, where the cold forced hugs and glasses of wine warmed up late-night conversations. But even in those moments, Oliver noticed that her laughter was more restrained, as if she was trying hard to appear present. He tried to rekindle what he felt was fading away. He bought flowers for no reason, organized a dinner in the garden, even wrote a long letter remembering everything they had experienced together. Emily smiled, thanked him, but didn't cry. And for him, that said a lot. She was always sensitive. He was always moved by simple gestures. Now her reaction was almost neutral, as if something inside her was shielded. Still, he refused to believe in any possibility other than exhaustion. I believed that she just needed time, and that together they would overcome this phase. Oliver's job was also demanding. Endless meetings, short trips to resolve crises in chain hotels, spreadsheets that seemed to multiply overnight. But he always came home in a hurry to see her. He made a point of telling her the details of the day, of asking about her projects, even when he received short answers. It wasn't ignorance. Emily wasn't cruel. But there was a silent absence in her gaze, as if she were caught between the desire to stay and the impulse to leave. Sometimes he would wake up in the middle of the night and notice that she was not by his side. I found her sitting on the balcony, looking at the sky. She said she couldn't sleep, that she liked the silence of the early morning. And he believed. I wanted to believe. Close friends noticed that something had changed. They discreetly commented that Emily was more introspective, that Oliver seemed more tired, quieter. But no one dared to say anything. After all, who could judge what is happening behind closed doors? The house was still clean, the garden was well cared for, the smiles were still there, even if less frequent. In the eyes of outsiders, it was still an admirable marriage. And maybe it was. A real wedding, with its lights and shadows, with its noises and silences, with its advances and setbacks. A marriage of two adults trying to make it work in a world where everything seemed to demand more than they could offer. That night in particular, Oliver arrived home early from work. It was Friday. I had bought her favorite wine and thought about cooking something special. As he parked the car, he noticed that the studio lights were on. Smiled. It was good to see her creating. That meant she still connected to something. He entered the house in silence, set the wine to cool and began to prepare dinner. With each step, he thought of words he could say to break what separated them. He thought about stories from the past, about promises of the future. I wanted to reconnect. He wanted, more than anything, for her to feel again what once brought them together so strongly. And that night, he would do anything to make it happen. What he didn't know was that same night, an invisible thread of destiny was already beginning to break, in a way that would change everything they had built, forever. It was late afternoon when Oliver, distracted between the pans and the aroma of the sauce that spread throughout the kitchen, realized that he had forgotten the artisanal bread he used to buy for special occasions. That Friday, in his mind, needed to be different. He wanted her to feel that there was still poetry in their love, that there was still warmth in the little things. He hurriedly grabbed the keys, left the pan on low heat and left. The market wasn't far away, but the route seemed longer that day. Maybe it was the weight of what he carried in his chest, that constant restlessness that had accompanied him for weeks like a silent shadow. When he returned, his eyes went straight to the studio, whose lights were still on. He entered without making a sound, placed the bread on the counter and, as he approached the stove, he smelled something burning. He turned off the heat with a sigh and smiled, a little frustrated but still excited at the idea of saving him with an improvised touch. She wasn't in the kitchen. Not even in the room. Not even in the room. He called his name once, then another. He walked towards the studio. But before reaching the door, the cell phone vibrated on the dining table. It was an unknown number. He ignored it for a moment, but the insistence of the call bothered him. He answered, expecting to hear the voice of someone selling something, or perhaps some mistake. On the other end of the line, a direct male voice said just one sentence that made him stop breathing: "Your wife is with her lover right now, at a romantic dinner." There was a silence so dense that time seemed to have stopped. The call dropped shortly afterwards. No explanation. No proof. But something in the way it was said, in the almost mocking tone of certainty, activated something inside him. That pang in the chest wasn't just surprise, it was confirmation. The intuition he had been stifling for months now had a name, a setting, a context. The first impulse was to doubt. But then he looked into the study, whose light was still on, and the half-open door revealed an empty space. Her car was also not in the garage. There was no message, no note, no warning. He then remembered a card from the restaurant that she kept in one of the drawers, a place that she said was her favorite, where she felt inspired, where she went alone to think, work, watch people. He pulled out the drawer. The card was there. And on the back, written in his handwriting, Wednesday, Friday and sometimes Saturday, always at 8 p.m. A shiver ran down his spine. He left the house with his heart pounding. I didn't know what I would find. I didn't plan what I would do. It just was. The car crossed the streets without him noticing the signs, the lights, the faces around him. His mind was spinning in circles, trying to find some possibility that would justify all of this. When he arrived, he parked a few meters from the restaurant. He observed the movement with steady eyes, as if searching for a painful but necessary truth. The atmosphere was elegant, large windows and soft lighting. Outside, you could see some tables near the glass. And then he saw her. The world stopped. She was there, sitting with another man, laughing lightly, holding the glass of wine with the same charm she used to use with him. The man in front of him was elegant, with restrained but clearly intimate gestures. They spoke with a fluidity that betrayed an already constructed story. Her eyes sparkled. And that glow, which had so often been his compass, now illuminated another universe. Oliver couldn't move. It was as if his feet were rooted to the ground. The pain was not overwhelming. It was silent, dry, like a cold dagger slowly piercing the flesh. He stayed there for a few minutes, unnoticed, just absorbing the image that tore his soul apart. Upon entering, the atmosphere became ironic. The soft lights, the ambient music, the smiles all around. Everything seemed to conspire to mask the chaos that was forming inside him. He walked to the table like a man with nothing left to lose. The two turned around at the same time. Emily froze. The face lost color. The eyes, once so alive, were now filled with despair. The man in front of him was visibly disconcerted. He tried to hide it, but there was no way. Oliver sat down. Nobody said anything for long seconds. The silence between them was deafening. She tried to open her mouth, but nothing came out. Her hand trembled over the napkin. The other man, visibly embarrassed, looked away, muttering something about leaving. But Oliver stopped him with a firm wave of his hand. I didn't want explanations. Not at that moment. He looked at Emily and saw not only the woman he loved, but also the woman who hid a life he never knew. The trust that once existed between them was now in pieces, spread out on that table with silver cutlery. He then took a small envelope out of his pocket and placed it on the table. The two looked confused. She hesitated, then took it with shaking hands. It opened slowly. Inside, there was a single sheet. Emily read it, and her face changed. First came surprise, then disbelief, and finally panic. His eyes filled with tears, and his breathing became uneven. The lover, without understanding what was there, tried to get closer to look, but she stopped him with an automatic gesture. Oliver then got up, straightened his shirt as if finishing a carefully planned scene, and left. He didn't look back. I didn't want to see anything anymore. In the car, his hands were still shaking. But his look was different. It wasn't the look of a defeated man. It was that of someone who, despite being broken, still had something saved. Something bigger than pain. There was a secret there, something he hadn't revealed at that table. Something that would completely change the course of everything that would follow. And this secret wasn't just an ace up his sleeve. It was the real blow. The final move of a piece that he would only move at the right moment. Until then, he would let the two of them digest what had just happened. Because now, the pain was theirs too, And that was just the beginning. The news spread silently through the company's corridors, through the looks of neighbors, through whispers among friends. Emily had been missing for 2 days since that night at the restaurant. Oliver, in turn, continued the routine with a strange calm, like someone who knows exactly what he is doing, like someone who has all the pieces on the board in their hands and is just waiting for the right moment to make the final move. He didn't respond to her messages, he didn't answer her calls, and he completely ignored his lover's attempts to explain or justify himself. He knew that any words now would just be noise. What mattered was elsewhere. Inside the leather briefcase that he carried to work every day, there was a contract with a fresh signature and a dossier that took months to prepare in secret. He watched time pass with surgical precision, knowing that the time would come, and when it did, it would be impossible to turn back. On the 3rd day, Emily appeared at the door. Hair tied up in any way, red eyes, sweaty hands. It was different. She was no longer the safe and confident woman who crossed the house with light steps. There was weight on his shoulders now, shame in his voice. He asked to come in, and he allowed it. He sat on the sofa, staring at the floor, as if he was looking for some strength there to say what he needed. He said he made a mistake, that he got confused, that he never intended to destroy what they had. She spoke about loneliness, about lack, about the feeling of having lost herself. But each word seemed to resonate with an invisible wall. Oliver just listened to her, with the same look he had when he saw her in the restaurant. A cold but lucid look. When she finished, the silence was broken by her firm voice, saying that that wasn't all. That she still didn't know what she had actually done. Emily, confused, tried to understand. He then asked me to accompany him. He said he would take her to a place, and that there she would understand everything. The journey was made in silence. She tried to ask where they were going, but he just asked for patience. They arrived at a commercial building, discreet, modern. They went up to the top floor. There was a meeting room with a view of the city. On the glass table, a folder. Oliver handed it to her. Emily hesitated, but opened it. Upon seeing the contents, his eyes widened. They were transfer documents. All the assets they once shared, house, vehicles, investments, were now being legally transferred to a foundation to support victims of marital betrayal. She opened her eyes wide, reading each clause. He explained that he had been working on it quietly ever since he realized something had changed between them. He said he did not act out of anger, but with precision. That if she wanted freedom, he was giving it. But this freedom came with a price. And that, from that moment on, she would no longer have anything that she despised. Emily started to cry. But it wasn't the cry of someone who lost property. It was the cry of someone who, for the first time, understood the depth of what they had done. He got up and walked to the window. Then, without turning his face, he said that there was still something more. Something she needed to hear. And that would forever change the way she would see herself from then on. Emily wiped her eyes and asked, in a trembling voice, what else he had to say. Oliver turned, walked to the folder and pulled out a separate sheet. He handed it to her. It was a company certificate. On it, her lover's name appeared as a minority partner in the investment company he had created a year earlier. Emily's eyes widened again, but before she could ask anything, Oliver began to speak. He explained that he had met that man before her. Which, for strategic reasons, had used its name as a front in a series of businesses. That he was just a piece in a much larger plan. And when he discovered the betrayal, he didn't limit himself to pain, he investigated, studied their steps, and began to silently move all the structures that had once been built around trust and appearance. But the hardest blow came next. Oliver revealed that, 2 months ago, he already knew everything. That the call he received that night was not a surprise, but the final point in a game he himself started. Emily, now, could no longer breathe properly. I asked how, when, why. He then said, with terrifying calm, that he had discovered everything when a financial transaction report showed unauthorized transactions from her personal account, directed to a corporate credit card in the name of his company, the same card used by her lover, for consumption in hotels, restaurants, and even personal purchases. Emily fell into a sitting position, powerless. Hands on lap, eyes vacant. I asked, almost in a whisper, why he had let everything happen if he already knew. Oliver then replied that he needed to see how far she would go. That I needed to understand if this was a mistake, a deviation, or an ongoing choice. And she chose. Repeatedly. 4 weeks. He said it wasn't about revenge, it was about consequence. And that, unlike her, he did not act on impulse, but on conscience. Emily tried to argue, saying that their relationship was lost, that she didn't know how to ask for help, that she felt invisible. But he cut it short, saying that love is resisting, not escaping. That every relationship has phases, pain, conflicts. But betrayal was not a symptom, it was a decision. And that she had chosen in the worst possible way. The last revelation, however, came when he said that, behind the entire foundation where he transferred the assets, there was something more. That the social projects developed there would be led by women who, like him, had been deceived, emotionally destroyed, but who decided to rebuild their lives by transforming pain into purpose. And that he was already in contact with one of them. A woman he had met by chance at a lecture, weeks before the discovery. A strong, resilient woman, who had been through the same thing, and who had now become his partner, and perhaps, more than that. Emily, with puffy eyes, just listened. His voice was choked, his face was red, his shoulders were bowed as if they were carrying the weight of it all. He tried to get up, but he couldn't. He apologized, said he didn't know how much he still loved him until he saw him leave. But Oliver didn't respond. He just looked at her with contained tenderness, like someone who respects a story, but understands that it has come to an end. The door opened. A security guard came in and handed her an envelope. Inside, the official papers of the dissolution of the marriage, already filed with the registry office. Oliver thanked her for the delivery, and asked her to take as long as she needed. Then he left the room in silence. There was no hatred in his eyes. There was only certainty that the cycle had ended. And outside, in the bright hall, a woman was waiting for him. With a shy smile and the eyes of someone who also knew the bitter taste of pain, but who, unlike Emily, had learned not to turn that pain into betrayal. Oliver extended his hand to her, and together, they walked towards the elevator. As the door slowly closed, the world spun in silence, giving way to what was to come. And nothing would be the same again. The air inside the room felt thicker than it should have. Emily was still sitting, staring at the papers in her hands as if trying to force reality to fall apart between the lines of contract and stamps. The silence left by Oliver was the kind of noise that occupied every corner of the room, the kind of absence that screams, that weighs. She read the documents once again, her eyes fixed on the words, "final dissolution," as if that could change. For a moment, everything in her wanted to run after him, run down those stairs and beg for a second chance, but her feet wouldn't move. Wounded pride and delayed awareness were tangled up in an internal duel that paralyzed her. For the first time, she didn't know where the ground was. For the first time, there was no control over what came next. Hours later, alone at home, surrounded by furniture that no longer belonged to her, Emily wandered from room to room like a shadow of her former self. The house seemed bigger, colder. She sat on the kitchen floor with a glass of wine in her hands and an almost deafening silence around her. That night he didn't sleep. He mentally reviewed each choice, each justification, each mistake, until he realized that he had never thought about the real consequences. I thought, deep down, that Oliver would always be there. That his presence was unchanging. Now, I understood that love also has a limit, and when it is crossed, what remains is not absence, it is transformation. On the other side of the city, Oliver felt lighter at heart, but still restless. He had made all his decisions consciously, without rushing, without impulse. And yet, there was a kind of emptiness, not from the lack of Emily, but from the shattering of the illusion that you can save a relationship alone. He knew that love requires mutual surrender. And that's exactly what was missing. The woman next to him in the elevator, Lara, was different. His eyes didn't ask for explanations, his words weren't loaded with comparisons with the past. She had met him in a completely unpretentious context, during a panel on emotional reconstruction in family businesses. What started with a shy coffee at the end of the talk gradually evolved into long conversations and, later, regular meetings. There was never any intention of anything, but there was space, and in that space, Oliver realized that it was possible to start over. Not as someone who replaces it, but as someone who understands that something new does not need to be a shadow of what is gone. The next day, Emily decided to look for Oliver. Not to try to win back, but because I needed to understand. I felt like there were still things left unsaid. When he arrived at the foundation building, he was greeted by a kind attendant, who informed him that he was in a meeting, but that he could wait. She sat in one of the reception chairs and looked around. The walls displayed paintings made by women who had been through abusive relationships, powerful texts about new beginnings and difficult memories. Little by little, she began to understand the purpose of it all. What she thought was elegant revenge was now revealed to be something bigger. Oliver didn't just want to punish her. He was turning his pain into something useful, real, concrete. The wait lasted almost an hour. When he appeared, their eyes met with a mixture of surprise and distance. There was still memory there, but there was no longer the silent bond that had connected them before. She greeted him with a shy wave, he nodded back. They went to a side room, more intimate. They sat facing each other, like strangers who knew everything about each other. Emily started with a simple but sincere question, "Did you hate me?" The answer came without delay, but without coldness. "No. I just stopped trying to fit into the space you left empty." She took a deep breath, eyes moistening, but maintained control. He said he understood now. That he didn't expect forgiveness, but needed to hear what was left from his mouth. Oliver was direct. He said that respect for her as a person continued, but the emotional bond, the desire to share a life, had broken. "You turned a page without knowing it was the end of the chapter," he said, with calm pain in his voice. "And now there's no going back. Because what I felt doesn't exist anymore." She tried to argue, not about love, but about the time lived, about the moments that seemed invincible. He smiled, sadly. "Moments are memories. But a wedding is more than a beautiful memory. It's presence. It's choice. And you stopped choosing me long before your first kiss with him." Emily lowered her eyes. "Not because I disagreed, but because he was right." She tried to ask him not to erase her from his life, to at least consider maintaining some connection, but he was kindly firm. "Life has shown me that sometimes erasing isn't revenge. It's protection." On the way out, as she walked back to the car, she passed Lara. The two looked at each other for a moment. There was no rivalry in the eyes, no provocation. But there was a dense silence, as if they both knew they carried different parts of the same man. Emily followed, with a heavy heart, but with her conscience more lucid than ever. Now, she understood that losing Oliver was not the result of betrayal itself, but of the sum of absences, of carelessness, of the belief that love can endure alone. Deep down, maybe I never believed he would leave. And when he went, he took with him the part of her that he still knew how to love without fear. Weeks passed. The divorce was finalized without legal disputes. Emily moved to a smaller apartment, went back to working on simple projects, and started therapy. The days were lonely, but strangely truer. He no longer needed to maintain appearances, nor balance between justifications and regrets. Now, what I had was the mirror. And in him, I saw a woman who learned the hard way that love only flourishes where there is presence and truth. On the other side, Oliver continued with the foundation. He grew as a man, as a professional and as someone willing to rebuild his life at a different pace. Lara didn't take Emily's place. It was another story. Another language. Another rhythm. But there was a new sincerity there, a different calm. And that was exactly what he was looking for. Later that afternoon, Oliver received an email from Emily. There was no pleading, no resentment. It was just a closing letter. She was grateful for the good years, accepted her part in the failures and said that, even though she had lost everything, she had gained the chance to know herself. And that she hoped, from the bottom of her heart, that he would find the peace that she once didn't know how to offer. He read the message with teary eyes, but a calm heart. He responded in a few words, "Thank you for recognizing it. I hope you find light on your path. Taking care of yourself is also loving." That night, Oliver and Lara walked along the riverbank. He held her hand lightly, without rushing. The breeze was cool and the city was slowly lighting up. Silently, he looked up at the sky and felt, for the first time in a long time, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And as much as the past still pulsed in some discrete part of his memory, he now knew that the future didn't need to be a reflection of pain, but an extension of the choice to be whole, even after being broken. In the days that followed, the consequences began to settle like dust in an abandoned room, revealing what had actually been lost and what, with effort, could still be reconstructed. Emily spent hours in silence, staring at the ceiling of her new apartment, which was cold, neutral, and had the personality of a place that had yet to be touched by affection. The rented furniture, the smell of fresh paint and the echo of lonely footsteps through the room seemed to reinforce the feeling of displacement, as if she were temporarily sheltered in a space that was not hers, not just by possession, but by the absence of any emotional meaning. The objects around them didn't tell stories, they didn't hold memories. They were just items. She tried to fill the void with work, resuming old projects and accepting small orders from clients recommended by acquaintances, but nothing seemed enough to silence the anguish that accompanied her like a constant whisper inside her head. Deep down, she understood that it was no longer about trying to win Oliver back or erase the past, but about learning to coexist with guilt. The therapy sessions helped, although each advance was followed by an avalanche of memories that, like waves, insisted on coming back with force. There was, within him, a battle between regret and shame. At times, she wondered if she deserved a fresh start. In others, he thought that perhaps this was his punishment, not his absence in itself, but the continuous presence of the memory of what he caused. The memory of his expression, his restrained voice, his firm decision not to return. And more than that, the weight of having lost not just a husband, but the man who was by her side even when she no longer knew if she was still capable of love. Meanwhile, on the other side of this story, Oliver found himself torn between relief and a strange discomfort that he couldn't name. He had rediscovered a form of peace that he thought was distant, and the connection with Lara gave him something he hadn't experienced in a long time, emotional stability without the pressure of being perfect. She did not demand answers to the past, nor comparisons. It was presence, and that was enough. Still, on some nights, when everything seemed in order, he would find himself staring at the ceiling of his room, his eyes open in the dark, remembering not good times with Emily, but fragments of the process that led him there, and those fragments hurt. Not because of the loss, but because of the way he had to reinvent himself in the face of what he swore would be eternal. It was during a conversation with Lara, on a rainy late afternoon, that he revealed something that still bothered him, the doubt whether he had been too fair, too severe, in cutting ties so definitively. She listened to him without judgment, with understanding eyes, and simply replied that justice sometimes requires harshness, but it never stops being human. He didn't comment further, but he felt that the scar was still there, not as an open wound, but as the mark of a personal war that required more strength than he ever imagined he had. In parallel, Emily's lover, who had been a brief and intense presence, was also experiencing his own silent breakdown. After being exposed, he not only lost the professional respect of many colleagues and partners, but also began to face difficulties in contracts and partnerships that, before, seemed unshakable. The association of his name with the fall of a marriage so well known in social circles became a veiled comment among business people, and his presence began to generate discomfort. He tried to contact Emily a few times, but she refused any approach. There was no more room for what began as an escape and ended as a disaster. It became just another reminder of how costly unwise choices can be. For her, the task now remained was to rediscover herself as an individual, without being supported by admiration or other people's desire, but only by the difficult journey of facing her own reflection and not looking away. It was then that an unexpected invitation arrived in Emily's inbox. One of the coordinators of the foundation created by Oliver invited her to give a talk about fresh starts in a creative career, aimed at women in the process of emotional reconstruction. The invitation, of course, did not come from him, and this was clear in the respectful and neutral text that accompanied the proposal. Emily spent hours staring at that email. He felt his hands sweat, his stomach turn, as if that message contained a trap. He thought about refusing immediately. But something inside her asked her to accept. Not as a way to redeem herself, but to offer other women something that she herself began to build, the courage to face her own mistakes and still not give up on becoming someone better. On the day of the talk, she wore a simple dress, the same one she had bought months before for an occasion that ended up not happening. He walked to the auditorium with measured steps, but without shaking. When she took the stage and saw dozens of women in the audience, many of them with attentive eyes and difficult stories engraved on their bodies and souls, Emily understood that this was not a moment about her, but about the power of vulnerability. He spoke sincerely, without flourishes, without trying to smooth out any flaws. He said that betrayal does not begin with the physical act, but with emotional disconnection. He told how he allowed silence to grow inside a home where there was love. And how it took him too long to realize that, instead of asking for help, he chose the path of escape. Some women cried, others applauded, but most importantly, she herself felt that, for the first time, she was being useful in a real way. Oliver was not present. I found out about the event days later, when the coordinator commented on the positive impact of the talk. He didn't react in an obvious way, just made a brief comment about how people can change when they decide to face their truths. Laura was at his side, reading a report. He didn't question, didn't make comments. He just held his hand for a few seconds, like someone who understands without needing to understand everything. And that was enough. The relationship between them was unhurried, without demands. There was space for the past, but no interest in reliving it. It was a relationship built on firm ruins, as if they both knew that the previous pain had created a more solid foundation for what they were experiencing now. Emily, in turn, began to dedicate herself more to social work linked to the foundation. She began developing art workshops for women in the process of separation, offering a form of expression that didn't require words. He rediscovered the joy in creating with purpose. It was no longer about aesthetics, but about meanings. Each environment I helped design for those women became a symbolic shelter, a place of belonging. And although there were still days when regret visited her with force, there were also days when peace took up space. She started visiting her parents more frequently, reconnected with old friendships that had drifted apart during times of crisis, and began writing a book, not about betrayal, but about reconstruction. An account of how, even after the worst falls, it is still possible to look forward with some kind of hope. At the end of one of these workshops, while closing the windows of the space and collecting paint-stained brushes, he felt his cell phone vibrate. It was a notification of a new email. When he opened it, he immediately recognized Oliver's name on the sender. The heart accelerated, the hands froze for an instant. He took a deep breath before clicking. The message was brief, objective, but filled with something that she couldn't immediately decipher. He said that he had heard about the lecture, that he admired the courage she had shown, and that he wanted her to remain firm on this new path. No opening for a reunion. No suggestion of rapprochement. Just recognition. And, paradoxically, that was precisely what touched her most. Because it was the first time I felt, without weight or demands, that perhaps I had managed to show him, albeit late, that I was also capable of growing. She responded with just a few lines, thanking him for his words and saying that she also hoped for his happiness, without further ado. And when he pressed the send button, he realized that there was no pain, no despair, no hidden desire. There was only peace. The kind of peace that is born not from the absence of loss, but from the deep acceptance that choices have weight, but that regret can be transformed into action, as long as there is truth. That email, exchanged in silence and respect, was more powerful than any reunion. And it signaled that the end, although inevitable, did not need to be noise. It could be a whisper. A closing whisper. A serene echo that, finally, they were both where they needed to be. Time ran its course with the relentless precision of clocks that care nothing for human pain. Months have passed since the last contact between Emily and Oliver, and each of their lives have taken paths that are as distinct as they are inevitable. The seasons changed and, with them, came changes that left no room for illusions or returns to the past. Emily immersed herself in the world of social reconstruction. The book she was writing, once an uncertain idea, took shape with the urgency of someone who needs to record what they have learned before their courage falters. He called it, "The Shards That Sustain Me," and, instead of seeking applause, he wrote like someone bleeding for the last time. The work was launched at a modest but meaningful event. In the audience were women who knew firsthand what it's like to have your identity torn apart by thoughtless choices, by silences that grow like toxic roots. Emily didn't expect recognition, but she received more than she imagined. The first edition was sold out. She began to be invited to seminars, social programs, and conversation circles in community centers. Little by little, his story stopped being just a confession and became an instrument of change. However, within her, a specific type of pain remained, that which comes not from loss, but from the certainty that someone irreplaceable in their own right was lost. The man who once shared her bed went on his way without looking back, but not without learning. Oliver transformed the foundation into a national model of support for emotionally betrayed people, expanding projects beyond what he had initially imagined. Social actions took shape, reaching new cities, integrating international networks. His name began to circulate in previously distant environments, and with that came awards, recognition, and greater responsibilities. But the most important thing was the intimate transformation. He did not become cold or cynical. On the contrary, he learned to filter more wisely who deserved to enter his world. Lara followed by his side, not as a substitute for anything, but as a true presence, who built a new story without the rush to appear perfect. Together, they opened an emotional rehabilitation clinic, aimed at couples in crisis, where he, even without positioning himself as a therapist, participated in dialogue circles, giving his perspective from his experience. More than rebuilding his own life, Oliver had become an active part in rebuilding other people's pain. And it completed him in a way he didn't even know he needed. The most unexpected part, however, came where no one else was talking about. Emily's ex-lover, who had disappeared from the radar after the scandal, reappeared months later in a television interview that went viral. In it, crying, he admitted everything: his participation in financial embezzlement, his involvement with the wife of a man who trusted him, and above all, the shame he felt for having been an accomplice in such profound emotional destruction. He said that ostracism was the best punishment he could have received. He was living on a modest salary, working as a driving instructor for newly licensed young people, and he confessed that, for the first time, he woke up without feeling like he needed to lie. The interview was harshly criticized by some, who saw it as an attempt at self-promotion, but for others, it revealed a rare facet: the public recognition of a guilt that is normally swept under the carpet. He didn't get involved with Emily again, nor did he try to justify himself to her again. He knew that silence was now the only possible gesture of respect. The story, however, still had one last twist. At a conference on emotional reconnection and relational ethics, Emily was invited to share the stage with other authors who also wrote about emotional breakdowns. Upon arriving at the auditorium, she was informed at the last minute that Oliver would be present. Not as a speaker, but as one of the event's guests of honor. His heart raced, not with hope, but with nervousness. It was the first face-to-face meeting after everything, after the end, after the book, the foundation, the mutual silence. She thought about leaving, but decided to stay. When she saw him at the entrance, she felt a chill run down her spine. He looked serene, whole, with the same eyes, but another man. They met eyes for a brief moment. He waved discreetly, and she returned a small, respectful smile. At the end of the event, there was an informal cocktail, and for the first time in a long time, they talked. They said little, but with truth. None of them apologized. None of them offered promises. They just exchanged impressions about the paths they followed, like someone who recognizes the past without wanting to inhabit it again. At the end of that night, everyone went their own way. But something had closed definitively and maturely. Like a door that locks from the inside, without violence, just with the certainty that you no longer need to enter there. Emily took a taxi home and, for the first time since everything happened, she lay in bed with a light heart. Not because she had one, but because she understood that forgiving herself was the only way to allow time to stop being a jailer. Oliver, in turn, upon arriving home, found Lara on the sofa reading. He sat down next to her, took her hand and looked at her as if he knew that love doesn't have to be grand all the time, but rather constant, coherent and reciprocal. You didn't talk about Emily. There was no reason. That was another chapter. And now, he was in another book. Fate, in the end, did not offer cinematic twists, romantic reunions or theatrical punishments. What he delivered was something rarer, coherence. Each character reaped what they sowed with their own gestures, their own omissions and their own choices. None of them emerged unscathed, but they all emerged transformed. And perhaps, deep down, this is the greatest punishment, and the greatest redemption possible. Because pain can destroy, but it can also teach. It can be an abyss, but it can also be a bridge. And whoever learns to cross, never comes back on the other side being the same person. If you've made it this far, I want to know, what did you think of this story? Would you have done it differently? Comment your opinion below, I will read everything carefully. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow other impactful stories like this. And always remember, this channel does not support any type of betrayal. Here, the stories are created to show how wrong choices can destroy lives and how each attitude has real weight. Until next time.